I knew something was wrong the moment my key didn't turn. I stood on the front porch of my house in Cedar Falls, Iowa, grocery bags cutting into my fingers, staring at the new brass lock like it had personally betrayed me. This was my house, the one I refinanced after my husband died, the one whose mortgage was drafted from my account every single month. I tried again. Nothing. Before I could knock, the door swung open, and there she was, my mother-in-law Judith Mercer, wearing my sweater. Not similar, not inspired by mine. The gray cashmere one I bought in Chicago 3 winters ago. She leaned against the doorframe, like she was welcoming a delivery she'd been expecting. "You're early," she said, checking her phone. "We thought you'd stay at the cemetery longer." My hands went numb. Inside my living room stood 2 men dismantling my bookshelves. Another was rolling up the rug my late husband picked out. Cardboard boxes were stacked neatly by the stairs, all labeled in Judith's precise handwriting. Estate, storage, donation. My name is Marlo Bennett. I'm 37 years old, a licensed speech therapist, and I buried my husband, Evan, 18 months ago after a construction accident that never quite made sense. Judith stepped aside, letting me in like a guest. She explained calmly, confidently, that the house was being reallocated. Her exact word. Apparently, Evan had promised the property would return to the Mercer family. Apparently, it was only fair since they had helped us so much. Helped us. I bought this house 5 years before I met Evan, with settlement money from a car accident that killed my parents when I was 22. My name was the only one on the deed. Judith knew that, or at least, she used to. She told me her attorney advised changing the locks temporarily. She said Evan's brother, Lucas, would be moving in after his divorce finalized. She said I could collect personal items later, once emotions settled. I noticed she never used the word mine. She talked like I was already gone. That's when I saw the photo frame missing from the mantel, the one with Evan and me at the state fair, powdered sugar on our faces. In its place was a silver-framed family portrait. Judith, Lucas, Evan, and me cropped out so cleanly it took effort. I felt something shift then. Not anger, not fear, clarity. Because Judith Mercer had made one fatal mistake. She assumed grief had erased me. She assumed the quiet woman who spent months barely surviving hadn't been paying attention. But I had, and somewhere in a locked fireproof box at my office, untouched since Evan's funeral, was a document he made me promise not to open unless his family ever tried to take what wasn't theirs. Judith smiled like she'd already won. I smiled back and let her believe it. I didn't argue with Judith. That surprised her. She expected tears, accusations, maybe a breakdown dramatic enough to justify everything she was doing. Instead, I calmly set my grocery bags on the kitchen counter and asked if I could grab my purse from the bedroom. She hesitated for half a second too long. "Make it quick," she said. "We're on a schedule." Of course you are, I thought. Upstairs, my bedroom looked like a hotel room after checkout. The dresser drawers were half empty. My clothes had been folded with unfamiliar hands. Judith's hands. I found my purse exactly where I'd left it. But what stopped me cold was the nightstand. The drawer was open, and the envelope was gone. The one Evan told me never to lose. My heart thudded, but I didn't panic. Panic is loud. Panic makes mistakes. Instead, I closed the drawer gently and went back downstairs. Judith was supervising the movers like a general inspecting troops. Lucas wasn't there yet, but his presence was everywhere. His old football trophies already lined up on my shelves. His boxes stacked neatly in the entryway like he'd always belonged here more than I had. Judith told me I could stay with a friend for a few weeks. She even offered to help me pack what was left. I thanked her. That really threw her. I left without another word and sat in my car until my hands stopped shaking. Then I drove straight to my office. The fireproof box was still locked in my filing cabinet, exactly where I'd hidden it. Inside were copies of everything: the original deed, refinance papers, insurance documents, and Evan's contingency plan. Because Evan loved his family, but he trusted me. 6 months before he died, Evan asked me to sign a postnuptial agreement. He said it was for clarity. His words. He wanted everything clean, documented, unquestionable. At the time, I thought it was odd. Now, I knew it was protection. Judith didn't know about the postnup. She also didn't know Evan had recorded their last argument. I sat at my desk and listened to his voice through my headphones. Calm, controlled, furious underneath. "You don't get to take her house," Evan said in the recording. "It's hers. It was always hers. And if you try, I swear I will burn every bridge you think protects you." Judith's voice followed, cold, dismissive. "We'll see," she replied. "You won't always be here to stop us." I closed my eyes. So that was it. This wasn't confusion, or grief, or entitlement. This was planned. I made one phone call to a property litigation attorney named Samuel Ortega. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said only one thing. "They changed the locks on a house they don't own," he said. "That's illegal. And stupid." I smiled for the first time that day. Judith thought she'd removed me quietly. What she'd actually done was give me leverage. And I was done being quiet. Samuel Ortega moved fast. By Tuesday morning, less than 48 hours after Judith changed the locks, he had filed an emergency motion for unlawful exclusion and temporary possession. In simple terms, Judith had trespassed, displaced a legal homeowner, and done it with witnesses, movers, neighbors, a paper trail so obvious it almost felt insulting. "People like her rely on intimidation," Samuel told me over coffee in his office. "They assume you'll be too embarrassed or tired to fight back." He was right. Judith had always spoken slowly, deliberately, like every word was a favor. She corrected people mid-sentence. She smiled while humiliating them. When Evan was alive, he buffered her sharp edges. Without him, she clearly thought I'd fold. She underestimated how grief changes you. Not weaker, sharper. Samuel showed me something else that afternoon: county records. Judith probably assumed I'd never check. 2 weeks before the locks were changed, Judith had attempted to file a lien against my property. The basis? Family financial contributions. The filing was rejected. Insufficient documentation. But the attempt alone told me everything. She was testing the system, Samuel said, seeing what she could get away with. And she wasn't done. That evening, Lucas finally called me. Not to apologize, to negotiate. He spoke in that familiar lazy confidence, like he was doing me a favor just by dialing my number. He said Mom didn't mean to upset me. He said maybe emotions ran high. He said maybe I could take some cash and start fresh somewhere else. When I reminded him the house was mine, legally and morally, he sighed. "Look, Marlo," he said, "you don't really need all that space." Embarrassing. That's what mattered. I asked him one question. Just one. Silence. I could practically hear the gears grinding in his head. "What postnup?" he asked. Exactly. Judith had kept him in the dark. She always did when it suited her. I ended the call politely and forwarded the recording. Evan made to Samuel's secure server. That recording changed everything. By Thursday, Samuel had secured a court-ordered re-entry. The sheriff would escort me back into my own home and supervise the removal of any unauthorized occupants. Judith received the notice that afternoon. She called me immediately. Her voice had lost its softness. "You're making a terrible mistake," she said, "dragging the family through the courts. Evan would be ashamed." That one almost hurt. "Almost. Evan warned me about this," I replied. "About you." She hung up without another word. Friday morning, I pulled back into my driveway behind a sheriff's cruiser. Judith stood on the porch, arms crossed, lips pressed into a thin line. Lucas hovered behind her, pale and confused. The locks were changed back. The movers were gone. And for the first time since Evan died, I crossed my own threshold knowing something important. They no longer controlled the narrative, and they were running out of moves. The house felt wrong even after I got it back. Not damaged, not missing anything important, just disturbed, like someone had gone through my life with gloves on and decided what mattered and what didn't. Judith's fingerprints were everywhere. The couch pillows aligned too perfectly, the books on my shelves rearranged by height, my space stripped of personality and turned into something presentable, control disguised as order. I spent that first night sleeping on top of the covers, fully dressed, my phone charging beside me like a weapon. Grief teaches you exhaustion, but betrayal teaches you vigilance. The next morning, Samuel called. "Judith's panicking," he said without preamble, "and panicking people make mistakes." He explained that after the court order, Judith had started making calls. Too many calls, to banks, to acquaintances in real estate, to an accountant who refused to speak to her without legal representation. That last part caught my attention. Samuel had pulled additional records overnight. Judith had been moving money between accounts tied to Lucas's failed construction business, money that didn't match reported income, money that flowed briefly through accounts Evan once had signing authority on years ago, before he quietly removed himself. She was using family, Samuel said, to launder risk. I closed my eyes. That's why she wanted the house. Clean asset. My name. My credit. My silence. That afternoon, Lucas showed up alone. No announcement. No apology. Just his truck in my driveway and his familiar knock, softer than usual. When I opened the door, he looked smaller, less confident. She didn't mean for it to go this far, he said. I didn't invite him in. You knew she changed the locks, I replied. And you let it happen. He swallowed. She said you agreed. A lie. A lazy one. I handed him a copy of the court order. I'm done cleaning up your family's messes. His face flushed. You're tearing this family apart. I almost laughed. No, I said calmly. I just stopped holding it together. He left without another word. That night, I listened again to Evan's recording. This time, I heard what I'd missed before. Not just anger, but fear. He knew his mother, knew what she was capable of when she felt cornered. My phone buzzed near midnight. Unknown number. Last chance to be reasonable. I didn't reply. Instead, I forwarded the message to Samuel and locked every door. Judith thought silence had protected her all these years. That people stayed quiet out of loyalty. She was wrong. They stayed quiet because no one had forced the truth into the open yet. And I was done being quiet. The envelope arrived on a Wednesday. No return address. Thick paper. Official enough to make my pulse spike before I even opened it. Inside was a notice from the state Revenue Department confirming receipt of third-party financial documentation related to Judith Mercer and Mercer Development LLC. I hadn't sent anything. Samuel had. With your permission, he said when I called him, calm as ever. What Evan left you wasn't just offensive. It was evidence. He explained that Evan's notes, combined with public filings and Judith's frantic money movements after the court order, were enough to trigger a preliminary review. Not an accusation. Not yet. An audit. Judith had spent her life avoiding scrutiny by hiding behind family, businesses and informal arrangements. An audit stripped away all of that. Numbers don't care about authority or guilt trips. That same afternoon, Judith called me. She didn't threaten this time. She cried. Real tears. Or at least convincing ones. She said she was scared. Said she didn't understand how things had spiraled so badly. Said she only ever wanted to protect the family. I let her talk. When she paused, waiting for comfort, I said, "You tried to steal my house." She inhaled sharply, like she'd forgotten that part. "You involved the government," she said quietly. "No," I replied. "You involved yourself." She hung up. 2 days later, Lucas was placed on administrative leave. His company's accounts were frozen pending review. He called me that night, drunk and furious, accusing me of ruining his life. I didn't argue. I just told him Evan tried to save them both. That he warned Judith to stop years ago. That everything happening now was delayed, not sudden. He went silent. By the weekend, the neighborhood knew something was wrong. Judith stopped attending church. Her for sale sign went up without a listing agent's name. Movers came and went at odd hours. She was liquidating, preparing, running out of space to hide. I spent that time reclaiming my house. I moved the books back into their proper places, rehung the photos Judith had removed. I burned the sweater she wore in my fireplace and watched the ash disappear. It felt ceremonial, necessary. On Sunday evening, Samuel emailed again. "Be prepared," he wrote. "Once auditors start asking questions, people talk." And talk they did. A former bookkeeper contacted the state anonymously, then a subcontractor, then someone from a bank branch in Cedar Rapids who recognized patterns that suddenly made sense. Judith's carefully curated reputation unraveled thread by thread. Late that night, I sat in my living room with the lights off, listening to the house settle around me. For the first time, it felt like mine again. Judith had taken many things from me over the years: peace, boundaries, trust. But the most dangerous thing she ever took was for granted: my silence. And now that it was gone, there was no stopping what came next. Judith stopped calling after the audit notice. Silence from someone like her is never peace, it's strategy. I knew she was calculating, deciding which version of herself would serve her best next. The grieving mother, the confused businesswoman, the betrayed matriarch. She tried them all. By the end of the following week, she had settled on victim. A local newspaper ran a soft focus piece about Mercer Development's unexpected financial review. No accusations, no details, just enough to introduce doubt. Judith was quoted extensively. She spoke about stress, about the toll of loss, about how she was heartbroken by false narratives. She didn't mention my name, but she didn't have to. 2 days later, a woman from church left a voicemail saying she hoped I wasn't misunderstanding things and that family disputes should stay private. Another neighbor asked if I was doing okay mentally. Judith's favorite weapon concern had been deployed. Samuel warned me this would happen. She's testing public sympathy, he said, seeing if she can isolate you. I refused to play defense. Instead, I focused on facts. I filed a formal complaint regarding the unauthorized lock change, supported by witness statements from the movers and the sheriff's report. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't emotional. It was documented. That same day, a certified letter arrived addressed to Judith from the state. Request for records, 10 years worth, deadlines, penalties for non-compliance. Her mask cracked. She showed up at my house that night. No warning. No call, just her car in my driveway, and her fists pounding on my door like she'd forgotten who owned it. I didn't open it. I spoke through the door, my voice steady. "You're trespassing," I said. "Leave." She screamed my name, accused me of betrayal, of ingratitude, of poisoning Evan against his own family. She said he would be ashamed of me. That one hurt, but it didn't break me. Evan trusted me, I said quietly. That's why this didn't work. She went silent. Then she laughed. A sharp, ugly sound. "You think you've won," she said. "You have no idea what you've started." I called the police. By the time they arrived, Judith was gone. The report was filed. Another record, another line in a growing file she could no longer erase. Later that night, Lucas texted me for the first time in days. "She's losing control. Please stop." I didn't respond, because this was never about stopping. It was about consequences. Judith built her life on the belief that no one would ever push back hard enough to matter. That family would absorb the damage to protect her image. She was wrong, and the mask she'd worn for decades was finally slipping. There was no putting it back on now. The knock came at 6:12 a.m. Not urgent, not aggressive, controlled, official. 2 investigators from the State Revenue Department stood on my porch. Credentials visible, voices polite. They weren't there to accuse me of anything. They were there because my name appeared repeatedly in Judith Mercer's financial records, and they needed context. I invited them in. For 2 hours I answered questions. I showed them the deed, the refinance paperwork, Evan's notes, the timeline he left behind, carefully documenting when his mother pressured him for temporary help, when money moved, when accounts were opened and quietly closed. One investigator, a woman named Hargreave, asked a question that stuck with me. "Did Judith ever explain why she needed to route money through you?" I shook my head. She never asked. She assumed. That answer seemed to satisfy them more than anything else I said. When they left, my house felt smaller. Not unsafe, just heavy. Like the truth had weight and it had finally settled. An hour later, Lucas called. He sounded exhausted. Not angry, not defensive. Just hollow. "She used my name," he said, "on things I never signed. Loans, lines of credit. She said it was bookkeeping." I believed her. I didn't interrupt. "She told me if anyone asked, you were unstable," he continued. "That you were confused after Evan died. That you didn't understand finances." There it was. The narrative she'd built to explain me away. "I'm sorry," he said. And for the first time, it sounded real. "I believe you," I replied, "but belief doesn't undo damage." He understood that. By that afternoon, Mercer Development's offices were closed for restructuring. Employees were told to work from home. Vendors stopped returning calls. The illusion of stability cracked publicly. Judith tried one last move. She emailed me a letter, long, rambling, half apology, half accusation. She claimed she was protecting me from myself. Claimed Evan begged her to take control. Claimed everything she did was out of love. I forwarded it to Samuel. "Do not respond. he wrote back. She's documenting emotion, not truth. That night, I stood in my kitchen and realized something strange. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger had fueled the early days, kept me sharp. But now, there was only clarity. Judith didn't ruin my life. She revealed herself. And once revealed, she had no power left. The next morning, the paper ran a second article. This one was different. Numbers. Sources. Confirmed investigations. Judith's name wasn't softened this time. It was exposed. And everyone who once whispered about me began asking a different question. How did no one see this sooner? I did, and I survived it. Judith disappeared from public view after the second article ran. No church, no charity luncheons, no carefully curated smiles at town events. Her social accounts went dark overnight, as if she believed silence could rewind time. But Cedar Falls is not a place where things vanish quietly. It's a place where absence speaks louder than presence ever did. Mercer Development officially suspended operations the following week. Employees were told the company would restructure pending review. That phrase became shorthand around town for "it's over." Contractors stopped showing up. The parking lot stayed empty. The building that once screamed authority now looked like a shell. Lucas came by again, this time during the day. He didn't knock like before. He rang the bell and stood back, hands visible, like someone approaching a wild animal he'd finally learned to respect. "I'm moving out of state," he said when I opened the door. "I got an offer in Minnesota. Different name on the paperwork. A fresh start." I nodded. "That's probably wise." He hesitated, then added, "She's blaming you for everything." I smiled faintly. "Of course she is. She says if Evan were alive, he'd hate you." That one landed harder than the others. I took a breath. "If Evan were alive," I said, "none of this would be happening." Lucas didn't argue. He just nodded and left. That night, I found something Judith had missed. Tucked behind the breaker panel in the basement was a slim envelope. No name. Just my address in her handwriting. Inside was a copy of my credit report from 2 years earlier with notes in the margins, circled numbers, questions. She had been studying my life like an asset long before she ever touched my locks. I scanned it and sent it to Samuel. His reply was immediate. "That's intent," he wrote. She didn't stumble into this. 2 days later, Judith was formally notified of expanded charges. Not just tax irregularities, fraud, identity misuse, false representation. The investigators wanted interviews. She declined. Her lawyer didn't. That evening, I walked through my house room by room. I opened windows, let in spring air. I washed the last mug she'd used and put it back where it belonged. In my bedroom, I replaced the nightstand drawer and slid Evan's envelope back inside. Not because I needed it anymore, but because it reminded me that love can outlive manipulation. The next morning, I woke up to a quiet house. No threats, no calls, no rumors, just space. Judith had built her life on access to people, to money, to narratives she controlled. One by one, those doors closed. And for the first time since Evan died, I didn't feel like I was surviving. I felt like I was moving forward, without her. The Monday after Judith's disappearance, the first calls started coming in. Not threats, not warnings, just inquiries. From people I hadn't spoken to in years, vendors, contractors, even minor investors asking questions they'd never asked before. Names I'd never heard whispered in family gossip, now showing up in emails, voicemails, and texts. They all mentioned one thing: Mercer Development. Judith had built an empire on fear and connections. Her control depended on the illusion of stability. That illusion was gone, and people wanted answers. I spent the morning compiling a list. Names, contacts, transactions. I remembered from the days when Evan had quietly tried to straighten the books. Phone numbers, dates, notes he'd made. Each piece fit neatly into the story of what Judith had done and how she had used family as a shield. Samuel called around noon. His voice carried that calm I'd come to trust. "They're reaching out to you because they need guidance, but mostly because they're scared. You don't need to respond to all of them." I laughed softly. "I feel like the last surviving adult in this town." He chuckled. "You might be the only sane one left." By late afternoon, a reporter from the Cedar Falls Gazette arrived at my doorstep unannounced. A polite knock, a professional demeanor, a notebook ready. I'm here about Mercer Development, she said. Can you comment? I'm just a resident, I said. I'm not involved with the company. I have nothing to add. The reporter nodded, jotted something down, and left. But the very act of turning her away sent ripples. Word would spread that someone knew more than they were saying. That someone had seen through the mask. That evening, Lucas called again, his voice softer this time, almost tentative. They're asking about me, he admitted. About my finances. My mother is telling everyone I'm responsible. I didn't say anything immediately. Silence was my ally. You don't need to answer, I finally said. You've done nothing wrong. He paused. But what about you? I smiled faintly, leaning back in my chair. I've done everything right. That's the difference. Later, I sat in the living room and looked at the photographs on the mantel. Evan's smile frozen in time. Reminders of stability and love. I realized that Judith had underestimated me. She assumed grief made me weak, that her presence, her manipulations, and her threats could dominate my life. She was wrong. And now, with the auditors asking questions, the community watching, and Lucas slowly realizing the truth, her empire was beginning to crumble in ways she hadn't anticipated. The silence in the house was deep that night. Not the oppressive kind of 2 years ago. Not the hollow echo of loss. It was a quiet that felt like justice, like anticipation, like the calm before the storm. Judith Mercer's control was gone, and I had no intention of letting her or anyone like her ever regain it. Tomorrow, the storm would begin in earnest, and I would be ready. By Wednesday, Judith's careful world was starting to crack. I had expected the audit to rattle her, but the scale of the disruption exceeded even my quiet hopes. Vendors who had once ignored me were suddenly calling, asking questions. Subcontractors who had once relied on her authority now sought clarity. Even Lucas's colleagues were reaching out to him, sharing information they'd quietly held for years, waiting for someone to listen. I wasn't involved in most of these conversations. I simply observed the pattern emerging. People wanted the truth, and they were finding it on their own. Around mid-afternoon, I received a package. No return address. Inside was a ledger handwritten, meticulous, filled with notes, calculations, and annotations that spanned more than a decade. It was clearly meant for me to find. Judith had tried to hide things electronically, but paper leaves a trail, always. I called Samuel immediately. This confirms everything, he said after, flipping through the pages over the phone. She tried to erase her tracks digitally, but she forgot the hard copies. This will be gold in the investigation. I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. So what now? Now, he said, we let the system do its work. She can't spin this anymore. The auditors have everything they need, and when the papers come in, she'll be exposed in a way no apology can fix. That evening, the neighborhood began to murmur. Judith had been spotted leaving her house late, looking frantic, documents in hand. Lucas had already moved most of his belongings to a storage facility. Neighbors whispered about phone calls, meetings, and hurried departures. I spent the evening in my living room, organizing my own files. Every receipt, every note from Evan, every document I'd collected since the first unauthorized visit to my house. It was a ritual of empowerment, proof that I was reclaiming my life piece by piece, document by document. Just after dusk, Lucas stopped by briefly. He was pale, tired, and anxious. She's trying to reach me, he said, threatening me, telling me to deny everything. You don't, I said firmly. You tell the truth. That's all that matters. He exhaled, a long, ragged breath, and nodded. You've changed things. I can't undo it. You can't. I agreed, but you can survive it. Later that night, I received a voicemail from an unknown number. No name, no explanation, just, she knows you're winning. I didn't respond, because winning doesn't always look like fireworks. Sometimes winning is quiet. Sometimes, it's knowing that the truth is finally breaking the walls built by lies. And Judith's walls were about to collapse completely. For the first time in years, I felt it, not grief, not fear, not anger, but certainty. The game had changed, and this time, I held all the cards. By the following Monday, the pressure on Judith Mercer was undeniable. I wasn't hearing directly from her anymore. She'd realized that calling me, yelling, threatening, any of it was futile. The authorities had my copies. Samuel had them too. And Lucas was finally starting to speak for himself. Instead, She turned her energy outward, trying to salvage what remained of her reputation. She sent letters to former clients, framed as updates, carefully crafted to make herself appear competent and rational. She scheduled late-night meetings, panicked phone calls to attorneys, and desperate attempts to secure loans or partnerships. It was chaotic but predictable. I spent the morning going over the ledger she had left behind in the package. Every line told a story: payments routed incorrectly, ghost invoices, unexplained withdrawals, misfiled documents. Evan had been right. Judith had underestimated the consequences of her own actions. Every single irregularity was now a potential lead for auditors, investigators, and even federal agencies. Around noon, Lucas called again. He sounded exhausted, but more resolute than ever. "She's trying to turn the family against me," he said. "I keep telling her I won't lie. She doesn't believe it." "Then you don't," I said. "Facts speak louder than her theatrics. Let the truth do the work." That evening, I received an anonymous message via email. Just a line: "She's counting on one of you breaking first." I frowned. Samuel immediately answered my call. "That's intimidation," he said. "Ignore it. Document it. It's exactly what she wants, to make you second-guess yourself. She won't succeed." I leaned back in my chair. 2 years ago, I would have panicked, would have doubted my decisions, my strength, my right to protect my home. But not anymore. By Thursday, whispers were becoming louder. Former contractors openly questioned payments. Lawyers debated documents in the local coffee shops. And even the town's small network of business owners discussed the unraveling of Mercer Development. Judith had thought she was untouchable, but every conversation, every inquiry chipped away at that illusion. I spent the weekend in my garden, hands in the dirt, planting herbs and flowers. The act of nurturing something living felt restorative, almost symbolic. The house was finally mine, not because I had fought with fire and fury, but because I had been patient, meticulous, and smart. Later that night, Lucas sent a text. "She's asking questions about you. She's worried." I smiled. A quiet, private smile. Judith had spent decades controlling narratives, intimidating family, and hiding misdeeds. But now, with evidence, documentation, and patience on my side, she was powerless. And the best part? I wasn't just surviving this time. I was winning, and the storm had only just begun. By Monday morning, I knew Judith had begun grasping at straws. Her carefully constructed network of influence was collapsing faster than she could manage. Vendors who had once feared her were now asking questions openly. Even her own employees were hesitant to answer her calls without documentation. And Lucas was growing stronger. He had begun confirming facts, quietly undermining her narrative from the inside. I didn't intervene directly. I didn't need to. My strategy was patience. Judith had always believed control was about aggression, about showing dominance. I knew control came from truth, evidence, and silence. The flash drive Evan had left me had become my invisible lever. I reviewed it once again, making sure every detail was clear, every timeline precise. The notes, spreadsheets, and emails she had failed to destroy painted a portrait of deliberate mismanagement, falsification, and manipulation, the kind of proof that investigators, lawyers, and auditors cannot ignore. I spent hours cross-referencing invoices with bank statements. Every inconsistency, every ghost payment, every suspicious expense she had labeled as business development or family emergency now had a clear explanation. Judith's network could no longer cover for her. That afternoon, I heard through the grapevine that the state auditors had requested another round of interviews, this time with her closest associates. Judith panicked. She had underestimated how meticulous the documentation I now held was, how clearly it tied her to mismanagement and financial deception. Lucas called in the evening, his voice tight but measured. "She's sending people after me," he admitted. "She's trying to scare me into silence." "You do nothing except what's right," I said firmly. "Do not respond. Document every call, every message. That's your armor." He paused, and for the first time, I sensed a shift. He was no longer the hesitant, conflicted man. That night, I sat in my home office and looked at the stack of folders I had prepared over the past weeks. Every contract, every bank transfer, every note carefully labeled and organized. The house was mine, My life was mine, and for the first time, it felt as though the past 2 years of fear and grief had a purpose. I made a decision. I would not confront Judith directly. I would let the evidence, the authorities, and time handle her. My role was strategic: prepare, protect, and wait. The pressure was mounting, and Judith was crumbling under the weight of her own actions. Outside, the night was quiet. The garden smelled of spring blooms. For the first time in years, I felt a profound calm, the kind that comes when you know you're on the side of right, when patience is your weapon and truth is your ally. Judith Mercer could scream, manipulate, or threaten all she wanted, but she was no longer in control. And I, finally, was free. The storm was approaching, but this time, I was not just surviving it. I was ready to watch it unfold.